Imagine packing up like just the bare necessities, and leaving behind your home and everything, to escape a life that's just become unbearable. You arrive in America hoping for safety and a fresh start, but instead of open arms, uh, you're met with suspicion, paperwork mountains of it,
Hmm.
in a system that just feels like it's designed to keep you out. It's a far cry from that welcoming image of the Statue of Liberty, isn't it?
Yeah, it really does underscore the complexities, I think, of seeking asylum here in the United States. That ideal of, welcoming those yearning for freedom often clashes with the political realities of immigration control, and that tension is exactly what we're going to be kind of unpacking today.
We're doing a deep dive today into the often overlooked history of the U.S. asylum system. We're using a really fascinating NPR Throughline episode as our guide, and we'll be uncovering how the system kind of evolved from these ad hoc responses to global crises to landmark legislation and that constant push and pull
Mhm.
between welcoming refugees and then tightening borders.
Yeah, we'll explore how certain historical events like the Vietnam War and the Mariel boat lift really forced the U.S. to confront those challenges of mass migration and how those experiences shape the policies that we see even today.
And get this, the very first law addressing refugees after World War II. The 1948 Displaced Persons Act actually favored ethnic Germans over others who were fleeing persecution. Even President Truman at the time criticized it for discriminating against Jewish refugees when he signed it.
Yeah, it's a powerful example of how even policies that are, crafted with good intentions can have these unintended consequences, and how often political agendas really influence those humanitarian efforts.
So let's rewind a bit.
Yeah.
Before the 1980s, the U.S. didn't even have a formal asylum system. It relied on these quotas that often reflected these really discriminatory attitudes towards certain nationalities and religions.
Yeah, the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act stands out as a particularly stark example. It severely limited immigration based on the 1890 census, effectively shutting out entire groups. Even at the time, critics condemned the law for fostering discord and division. I mean, just imagine how different America's cultural landscape might be today if that law hadn't been enacted.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to me that that discriminatory law stayed in effect for decades.
Yeah.
And adding to the complexity, despite the escalating persecution in Europe during the 1930s, the U.S. didn't even fill its very limited European quotas.
Right. It points to a lack of political will to aid refugees, especially those fleeing Nazi Germany. It's a somber chapter in American history that raises those tough questions about our nation's response to those seeking refuge.
Then comes the Vietnam War, and with it, a massive refugee crisis. This forced the U.S. to finally create a formal system for processing refugee admissions and resettlement, the Refugee Act of 1980. On the surface, it seemed like a huge step toward a more humane approach.
Yes, this landmark legislation was designed to create a more structured and compassionate process. But it was immediately put to the test. The Mariel boat lift in 1980, when over 125,000 Cubans arrived in Florida, exposed the limitations of the system in handling a sudden influx of people.
Right, and that wasn't all. Around the same time, the U.S. also saw a surge in Haitian refugees who were seeking asylum. And this further strained this newly established system and revealed its vulnerabilities in dealing with these large-scale arrivals.
And what's really interesting about this period is the shift that we see in public perception about asylum. While the UN had welcomed some refugee groups in the past, the sheer number of Cubans and Haitians arriving sparked fear and backlash among some segments of society.
Yeah, it really brought those political dimensions of the issue to the forefront, and it demonstrated how quickly public sentiment could change when confronted with a large-scale humanitarian crisis.
The Cold War also played a significant role in shaping U.S. asylum policies. Decisions about who to welcome and who to turn away were often made through the lens of Cold War politics.
It's almost like the U.S. had this double standard when it came to refugees.
Yeah, that's fair to say. For instance, Cubans fleeing Fidel Castro's communist regime were often seen as victims of communism and welcomed with open arms. Their arrival was even used as a propaganda tool to contrast the freedoms of the West with the oppression of communist regimes.
But at the same time, Haitians fleeing the brutal Duvalier dictatorship, which was ironically backed by the U.S., faced a very different reality.
Right, their claims for asylum were frequently denied, and many were intercepted at sea and returned to Haiti before they could even set foot on American soil.
Yeah.
This stark contrast, I think, reveals how foreign policy considerations often overshadowed humanitarian concerns when it came to asylum decisions. The U.S. even signed an interdiction agreement with Haiti.
So the Coast Guard was actively stopping Haitian boats before they could even reach U.S. shores to request asylum.
Precisely, it paints a stark contrast to the open-door policy extended to Cubans fleeing communism. These contrasting approaches, they make you question, was humanitarian aid truly the driving force behind these decisions, or were strategic interests taking precedence?
It's a sobering thought. This really highlights the complex interplay between politics and humanitarian aid.
Mhm.
The NPR episode we're discussing dives deeper into the historical context to shed light on how we arrived at this point. It takes us back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a time of mass immigration to the U.S. Think about it, people arriving from all corners of the globe,
Wow.
China, Germany, Ireland, England, all seeking refuge from things like famines, job shortages, political upheavals.
And this wave of newcomers triggered anxieties and a backlash among certain groups in America. Concerns about economic competition, shifting cultural norms, and the fear of losing a perceived American identity fueled this push for immigration restrictions. It's a pattern that we've seen repeat itself throughout history, often with, detrimental consequences.
You're right. It's disheartening to see how these anxieties resurface time and again.
Yeah.
It seems like every few decades there's this resurgence of this anti-immigrant sentiment. The Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which we touched on earlier, is a prime example of how these anxieties manifest into policy. That law slammed the door shut on many immigrant groups by imposing strict quotas based on the 1890 census.
The aim was to drastically curtail immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as Asia, reflecting the prevailing racial and ethnic prejudices of the era. It's a stark reminder of how deeply embedded these biases can be and how they can shape legislation with far-reaching consequences.
It's almost unbelievable how blatantly discriminatory that law was, and the fact that it remained in place for decades.
Mhm.
It's a stark reminder that progress is often a slow and arduous process. It makes you question how could such a law even be enacted in a country that prides itself on principles of freedom and opportunity for all?
Yeah, it exposes that gap that often exists between ideals and reality. It underscores that the path towards a more just and equitable society is rarely linear, and it's often marked by setbacks and challenges.
It also highlights the importance of remaining vigilant and challenging policies that are unjust, regardless of how widespread support for them might seem at a particular moment in time.
Absolutely. We must constantly scrutinize our
Yeah.
systems and hold our leaders accountable for creating policies that uphold fairness and human dignity. The Through Line episode delves into a particularly poignant period. The U.S. response, or rather the lack thereof, to the plight of Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Despite the clear and present danger they faced, the U.S. did not fill its existing quotas for European immigrants.
It's truly heartbreaking to think about all the lives that could have been saved if those fleeing persecution had just been given refuge. The episode mentions that this lack of action wasn't solely limited to government officials. Public opinion at the time was also largely unsympathetic to Jewish refugees.
Right. This underscores that prejudice and indifference can permeate all levels of society, and that silence in the face of injustice can be just as damaging as active hostility. It's a lesson that remains relevant even today as we confront contemporary challenges related to refugees and asylum seekers.
It wasn't until after World War II, when the full horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, that the U.S. began to truly grapple with its responsibility to those seeking refuge. But even then, the response was often fragmented and driven more by political calculations than purely humanitarian impulses.
Yeah, take the 1948 Displaced Persons Act, for example. It was designed to aid European refugees, but it contained provisions that favored specific groups like ethnic Germans over others. It's a classic example of the compromises and competing priorities that often shape refugee policy.
And even President Truman, when he signed the act, expressed reservations about its discriminatory aspects. But he felt compelled to provide some relief to those displaced by the war. It highlights those complex dilemmas that often face policymakers. This period also marked a turning point in global politics, as the Cold War began to take shape, and that had a profound impact on how the U.S. viewed and responded to refugee crises around the world.
You're absolutely right. The emergence of the Cold War created a new lens through which the U.S. viewed refugees and asylum seekers, often prioritizing those fleeing communist regimes while turning away those escaping conflicts or persecution in countries aligned with U.S. interests. This Cold War mindset had a lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy and continues to influence how we approach humanitarian crises today.
It's almost as if the U.S. began viewing refugees through the lens of geopolitics, prioritizing those fleeing communist regimes while neglecting those escaping hardship in countries aligned with U.S. interests. It's a pattern that unfortunately persists in contemporary times. The episode provides striking examples of this dynamic at play. For example, Cubans fleeing Fidel Castro's communist regime were generally welcomed with open arms during the Cold War.
They were perceived as victims of communism, and their arrival in the US was even leveraged as a propaganda tool to highlight the perceived superiority of American democracy over communist systems.
However, Haitians fleeing the brutal Duvalier dictatorship, a regime that was ironically supported by the U.S., faced a much harsher reality. Their asylum claims were often dismissed, and many were intercepted at sea and sent back to Haiti facing potential danger upon their return. It's a glaring example of how political expediency often overshadowed humanitarian principles in the realm of asylum decisions.
This double standard, where certain refugees are welcomed while others are turned away based on political calculations, raises troubling questions about the true motivations behind U.S. asylum policy. It suggests that humanitarian concerns are often intertwined with strategic interests, creating a complex and ethically challenging landscape.
This pattern seems to continue in the present day, doesn't it? We see it in the ways in which the U.S. responds to various refugee crises around the world. The historical context is crucial for understanding how we arrived at this point, but it also compels us to confront challenging questions about the path forward.
Indeed, how do we create a refugee and asylum system that is genuinely fair, humane, and aligned with the values we espouse as a nation? It's a question that demands careful consideration and a willingness to acknowledge the complexities and historical baggage that shape our current system. We need to move beyond simplistic solutions that prioritize enforcement over compassion and instead seek comprehensive approaches that address the root causes of displacement and uphold the dignity of those seeking refuge.
It feels like we're at this crossroads. We have this system that's been molded by shifting political priorities and events, and it's clearly not working as intended.
Yeah, I'd agree the current system is burdened by massive backlogs. It's underfunded
Yeah.
and often seems to place more emphasis on border control than on offering a genuine safe haven.
The through-line episode really drives home the human cost of these systemic failures. They talk about asylum seekers facing years-long waits just for their cases to be heard,
Yeah.
living with this constant uncertainty and fear and just limited options. They can't work legally. They have limited access to social services. And it's incredibly difficult to build any semblance of a stable life. They're stuck in this bureaucratic limbo.
It's a dehumanizing process. We have to remember these are real people with families, aspirations, and dreams who are simply seeking safety and a chance at a better future, and instead they're met with a system that can feel designed to just wear them down.
The episode also points out that these backlogs and delays in processing asylum claims are partly a result of that shift towards border security and enforcement that began in the 1990s
Yeah.
and has only intensified since then.
Exactly. Funding for Border Patrol detention centers and other enforcement measures has just skyrocketed, while funding for immigration courts and asylum processing has not kept pace. It's like trying to pour a gallon of water through a straw. The system just can't handle the volume.
Creating that bottleneck effect you mentioned earlier, so many asylum seekers are stuck in limbo, their lives on hold, while they just wait for their cases to be decided.
And this benefits no one except perhaps those who profit from exploiting vulnerable migrants like smugglers and traffickers. It makes the entire process even more treacherous for those legitimately seeking safety.
It's a vicious cycle. So knowing all this, where do we go from here? Is there a way to fix a system that feels so broken?
That's the question, isn't it? There are no easy solutions, but I think the first step is to recognize the complexity of the issue and move away from simplistic enforcement-only approaches that just focus solely on border security. We need to stop treating the symptoms and start addressing the underlying causes.
So a more holistic approach then, one that takes into account the reasons why people flee their home countries in the first place and provides a system that balances security concerns with the humanitarian needs of those seeking refuge.
Absolutely. We need to invest in solutions that address the root causes of migration, like poverty, violence, and persecution. Imagine if we focused on creating conditions where people felt safe and secure in their own countries. At the same time, we need to ensure those who do arrive seeking asylum have access to legal representation, health care, and other essential services while they wait for their cases to be adjudicated. A system that offers support and a fair process instead of adding to their trauma.
This deep dive has certainly been eye-opening for me. It's made me realize just how much I still need to learn about this issue and how important it is to have these conversations and advocate for change.
I think that's a great takeaway. Complex issues can feel daunting, but it's through these conversations that we can find common ground and work toward meaningful solutions. We can't let the complexity paralyze us.
To our listeners, I encourage you to delve deeper into this issue, do your own research, learn more about the asylum system, and consider how you might get involved. Perhaps you can volunteer with an organization that supports asylum seekers donate to a relevant cause, or simply educate yourself and others about the challenges they face. Even small actions can contribute to positive change.
And remember, what we've discussed today is just one perspective on a multifaceted issue. There are many different viewpoints and proposed solutions out there. Don't be afraid to explore various resources, engage with diverse perspectives, and form your own informed opinions. Critical thinking and engagement are crucial for navigating complex challenges like this one.
That's what the deep dive is all about, encouraging you to think critically and engage with the world around you in a deeper, more meaningful way. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a fascinating and important topic.